I hate this so much. I was so ready for it to do this slideshow, and the moment I hit record, it stops being in slideshow mode, and then I get into slideshow mode and you can't see my little face. Why can't you see my little face? Why? Tell me why. Ain't nothing but a heartache. Tell me why. Ain't nothing but a mistake. Tell me why. Y'all, can I just hide? Hey guys, I desperately, what if I did something like this? I'm gonna cheat the system. Can you get any wider? No? Okay. Okay. Also, I have this tiny little microphone. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Go ahead and smash that like and subscribe button and ring the bell if you would like notifications. Anyways, oh, I hate this. I hate this. I hate this. Okay, so I'm presenting my student lecture, which was part of a class, my class Psychopathology, and the personality disorders unit. I want to preface this by saying that this is my semi-educated, not professional, conclusions drawn about a real life individual. So I am not in a position of authority. I have never met Casey. I cannot diagnose her. This is simply my educated opinion from what I can gather from afar, okay? I really hope that this microphone is picking anything up and I'm not just holding this in front of me for no reason. It was worth $5. I got it from Target, and I don't have very high faith in it, but I thought it would just be really fun to just hold like a tiny little microphone. So that's what I'm doing. I also have a script. I'm gonna have to kind of go off script sometimes to explain some of these concepts that you guys who just like aren't in the field wouldn't know. Okay. So, also, I probably should have removed the other students' names before I post this on the internet. This, as I'm presenting it to you, does not reflect anyone other than my educated opinion. I will also say that as well. So, let's go ahead and get started. Today we will be discussing the psychopathology of Casey Anthony as it relates to the case of the state of Florida versus Casey Marie Anthony. First of all, and this was for class interaction, who has heard of Casey Anthony? Okay, for fun, who believes she's guilty? All right. Spoiler alert. Wow. Casey Anthony was found not guilty in 2011 for the murder of her 2-year-old daughter, Kaylee. We will go over different aspects of the criminal case in our presentation. My presentation, I should say. Um, and I want the main focus to be on Casey's behaviors before and after her daughter went missing, and she was charged and then eventually exonerated of the crime. We will start on July 15th, 2008, with the initial 911 call that Casey's mother, Cindy, made. So, hopefully maybe you can hear this. Okay. Oh, go ahead and not replay that. All right. Kaylee Marie Anthony was last seen around 2 in the afternoon on June 16th, 2008. The last known person to have seen Kaylee before her death sometime in the later afternoon or evening was her mother, Casey. Earlier in the day, Casey brought Kaylee to her parents' house to pack some things for the day, telling her father, George, that she had to work and that Kaylee would be with the sitter, Zanny. George was off to an afternoon shift at his security job and said goodbye to the both of them as they hopped in Casey's white Pontiac Sunfire and took off down Hope Spring Drive. In the following 31 days, Casey told her parents that she was away on various trips for work and that Zanny the nanny was able to watch her daughter. She denied any help from either of her parents who wanted to babysit their granddaughter. She evaded and refused their attempts to speak with Kaylee or to see either of them. It was in mid-July, when George Anthony received notice from an impound, that Casey's Pontiac Sunfire had been towed. After retrieving the vehicle, they found all of Kaylee's belongings still in the back seat. At this point, Cindy set out to directly confront her daughter in person. Cindy called 911 3 times. First, to report that Casey had stolen and abandoned a car that belonged to them, then to report that the car smelled like a dead body, and then finally to announce that no one, not even Casey, had seen Kaylee in a month. Casey was asked why she failed to report her missing child for a total of 31 days, and she said it was because she took it upon herself to search for Kaylee and her sitter. She led police to Zanny's apartment complex, which police discovered had actually stood vacant for months. She also described Zanny the nanny in detail, only for the police to discover that no such woman by Casey's description exists. Finally, the police met Casey at her place of employment, Universal Studios. At this point, the police had already discovered that Casey had not worked at Universal Studios in 2 years, but they wanted to see how far Casey would take a lie. The police observed Casey being argumentative and performative with the Universal Studios guard. She told him she lost her employee badge, but provided a fictitious supervisor name, extension number, and employee ID number. After being told she is not in the system at all, She continued to insist on being let in until the police ordered that they allow her to pass through. She walked around the building for about 20 minutes before giving up, turning around, laughing, and stating, "Okay, I don't actually work here." It was then that the police told her that they know she's been lying to them about everything, and she was arrested on the grounds of child neglect. What you are about to hear is Casey's first phone call from jail, in which her only focus is on talking to her boyfriend. It happened twice. Okay. Casey's vehicle was examined in late October of 2008, and forensic experts found what they believed to be one of Kaylee's hairs in the trunk. This hair had death banding on it, which is only present when the hair has come from the head of a decomposing body. I'd also like to note that this hair was untreated hair, which is most certainly from a child, especially since they could verify that it's a female of the Anthony family. Casey and her mom Cindy both had treated their hair before, and Kaylee obviously was too and would not have dyed or permed her hair at any point. They also found chemical compounds in an air sample of the trunk of the car that were consistent with human decomposition. This was also a new, forensic evidence introduced in a court of law, and so there was a lot of controversy as to whether or not it was met all the Daubert standards for admissibility. It was obviously admitted, but there was a lot of should we take this with a large grain of salt or not? Many witnesses attested to the scent of death being present in Casey's trunk, including both of her parents. They additionally found bloat or coffin fly maggots in the vehicle, particularly the trunk, as well. On December 11th, 2008, the highly decomposed remains of Kaylee Marie Anthony were found less than half a mile away from the Anthony family home. Most bones were found in a bag that had been picked apart by animals, but her skull, some other bone fragments, and her clothes were spread out on the ground. The skull had duct tape wrapped around the nose, mouth, and jaw, but because of the body's exposure to the elements and woodland creatures, investigators were unable to determine the cause of death for certain. It's at this point that the prosecutors decided to pursue the death penalty for Casey Anthony. So, yikes. Casey was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, as well as with 4 counts of providing false information to a law enforcement officer. Casey's defense lawyer, Jose Baez, relied on Casey's assertion that George Anthony had sexually abused her from ages 8 to 12. Casey's concern as a mother living in her parents' house with her 2-year-old was that Kaylee would be George's next target. She claimed that on June 16, 2008, she was asleep with Kaylee when her father woke her up and Kaylee wasn't there. They each went looking for Kaylee, and her father found her in the pool. She appeared to be deceased, so George took the child out of the room and Casey never saw her again. The defense argued that George blamed Casey for not watching over Kaylee, and then he told her that he would take care of it. It was Casey's reported belief that George sexually assaulted Kaylee, an altercation ensued resulting in her death, and that George woke Casey up to show her and blame her before taking and disposing of Kaylee's body. Casey was in so much shock and fear that she chose to believe that Kaylee was still alive under George's watch somewhere, until, of course, the child's body was found. When George took the stand as a witness for the prosecution, he vehemently denied every one of these accusations. Additionally, no charges have ever been filed against him, and no other witnesses have corroborated Casey's statements about her father. Yikes. The prosecution may have relied too heavily on painting a picture for the jury that Casey's motivation for the crime was her desire to be a wild and free party girl. In the time after Kaylee was last seen, Casey was found dancing on tables, participating in a hot body contest, stealing hundreds of dollars from a friend to go on shopping sprees, getting her nails done, and even getting a tattoo on her left shoulder that reads Bella Vita, which is Italian for beautiful life. In a passage from her journal, which was believed to be written in the 30 days that her daughter was missing, Casey wrote, quote, "I completely trust my own judgment and know that I made the right decision. I just hope that the end justifies the means. This is the happiest that I have been in a very long time. I hope that my happiness will continue to grow." End quote. Although Casey's behavior most certainly supports the prosecution's narrative, her attitude alone was not convincing enough of her guilt in the eyes of the jury members, who found it difficult to believe that a young mom would murder her toddler for the sole reason of wanting to go out and party. It may have been a more powerful argument had the prosecution been able to supply their own mental health expert testimony. Maybe then, a clear explanation of Casey's psychopathology would make her potential motivation more compelling. Casey was evaluated by 2 forensic psychiatrists hired by her defense lawyer. The first expert, Dr. Jeffrey Danziger, administered the MMPI and noted that the only elevated scale was the masculine-feminine scale. He believed that Casey was psychologically healthy, and the only standout result of his evaluation was that she was more of a tomboy than other girls. Danziger also stated that Casey was always oddly cheerful when they interacted, which was an unexpected disposition to have for someone in her position. The second expert, Dr. William Weitz, specialized in trauma and chose to administer the trauma symptom inventory. It's a brief measure. It yielded results that led him to believe that Casey was traumatized. He shared in a deposition that Casey's validity score was in the higher range of normal, but that his overall impression was that she felt traumatized, which she attributed to being abused by her father. So when we say that her validity score was close to elevated at a 60, what that essentially means is if the validity scale, which is a subscale of the TSI, had hit 65, it would indicate that you need to consider that the person responding was exaggerating. So it's not outright saying, okay, this is a false test or that she's lying, but it could be. And so yes, she was in the normal range, but it is interesting that she is close to being, like, her validity, the accuracy of her responses could almost be called into question. I just think that's pretty interesting. The state of Florida moved to have a state-appointed mental health evaluation performed, at which point Casey's defense team filed a motion to prevent that from happening. It was decided that they would not include any mental health expert testimony, and thus neither should the state. As a result, all of the information gained from evaluating Casey was left out of the trial, and no one other than the defense-appointed experts were given the chance to evaluate her. After about 6 weeks of testimony, the jury reaches the verdict of not guilty for Casey on all charges except for lying to police. Casey was then sentenced to time already served, which made her a free woman less than 2 weeks after her not guilty verdict. Juror number 3, Jennifer Ford, gave a statement that the jury was not compelled enough by the prosecution to find Casey not guilty, saying, quote, "If you cannot prove what the crime was, you cannot determine what the punishment should be," end quote. By the end of July, Casey Anthony was a free woman against all odds. This presentation does not seek to debate all of the 400 pieces of evidence brought forth within the case, nor the testimony of the 100 witnesses involved. The majority of the public is certain that Casey is, in fact, responsible for her child's death. The rest of this presentation will attempt to focus on the ways Casey behaved before, during, and after this case that depict an abnormal psychopathology, particularly one that is indicative of narcissism. Let's begin with Casey's background. Casey was born in Warren, Ohio in 1986 to parents Cindy and George Anthony. She is the youngest of 2 children with one older brother named Lee. The family moved to Orlando, Florida when she was a toddler. Her parents had a difficult relationship at times, and many who knew them would indicate that Cindy was always the one who was in control. Growing up, Casey loved math and science and spent a lot of time being active and sporty, as well as enjoying photography. She even won awards throughout school for her helpfulness and citizenship, and she was very much a perfectionist as a teenager. Casey felt that she always had plenty of guy friends around and that they were easier to get along with than most girls. She did not have any interest in drug use, and only until her 20s did she drink alcohol. She believed her mother, Cindy, to be her biggest critic, and she claimed that her mom once even called her a whore, straight to her face, which is so lovely. Clinical psychologist Dr. William Weitz would later say of Casey that she always had a man in her life. Probably for protection and security, probably of an emotional kind. Quote, "My thinking was that she always had a male replacement, a boyfriend, when she ended a relationship," end quote. Another interesting note from Dr. Weitz's deposition is that he believed Casey to have an overbearing and flirtatious personality. When Casey was in high school, one of her friends said of her ability to avoid conflict, quote, "She could diffuse things or push them away or make you feel like maybe you had misunderstood her. I remember talking to her about some guy that I thought maybe she had shown an interest in when I was still with him, and she made me feel badly for even thinking that. She was like, 'I would never. You have to believe me,'" end quote. Another time, a friend said that she had never really had long-term intimate relationships on a friend level, indicating that she would be very affectionate at times and then suddenly move on. Quote, "It's like a butterfly. You see her, and then she's gone," end quote. In Casey's senior year of high school, she started skipping classes to hang out with an older boyfriend, and thus she began failing. Because of this, her school refused to let her graduate, but Casey did not tell her parents this. Her parents planned a large graduation party for her, only to discover that she would not be receiving a diploma. Even so, the entire family saved face by hosting the party anyway, and keeping all of the gifts and money received from family and friends. Casey's grandparents attended the ceremony at the high school and were told by Cindy that the reason Casey was not walking on stage was due to a mix-up on behalf of the school. Casey went on to work at a Kodak station in Universal Studios, but the job did not last long, and she was fired in April of 2006. Before being terminated, though, she met Jesse Grund there, who was a new boyfriend turned fiance turned ex-fiance. All the while, her family was under the impression that she was still employed. It became apparent around this time that Casey, age 19, was pregnant. She never revealed who the father was, but after giving birth, she tried to convince Jesse that he was the father, even though they had not yet met at the estimated time she conceived. Casey denied being pregnant to everyone until she was a full 8 months along. At one point, a family friend asked why she hadn't announced that she was pregnant. And Casey's response was that she was still a virgin, and she had just been retaining a lot of water lately. Her parents accepted this as truth until her uncle saw her belly and insisted that she was practically about to give birth and that her parents needed to take her to a doctor to verify it. Kaylee was born on August 9th, 2005. Both of Casey's parents welcomed baby Kaylee into the family with open arms, so much so that Cindy insisted on being the first to hold Kaylee after being born, and Casey had to wait to hold her own newborn child. This almost certainly began a conflict over who was more capable of mothering the baby. She continued to live at home with her parents and siphon money from her friends, parents, and grandmother by stealing checks from them. Casey would also depend on her friends for free babysitting while she was supposedly at work, when in reality she would spend this time either with a boyfriend or other friends, hanging out and partying. She spent hundreds of dollars that did not belong to her and spent many hours each week telling different people that her daughter was at a sitter's, when in reality she was being left with whomever was available to watch her. It is around the time Kaylee turned 1 year old that Casey started telling her parents about a nanny she hired named Zenaida, or Zanny. The truth of the matter was that Zanny did not exist, and Casey's routine became as follows. Leave home for work in the morning, work in quotations. Wait until Cindy and George leave for legitimate work. Drive back home and sit around all day with Kaylee. Cindy and George would come home from work. Casey asks them to watch Kaylee while she goes out for the night. And then Cindy and George are left with the impression that Casey never spends any time with her daughter because she's at work all day and then never home in the evenings. It even came to a point where Cindy was so convinced of Casey's carelessness as a parent that she seriously considered fighting for custody of the baby. This may have been interpreted by Casey as an extreme insult and also as a sign that her mother, Cindy, loved Kaylee more than her. So there's that interpersonal conflict. It's possible that her parents' willful ignorance and continual maneuvering around Casey's lying only reinforced the notion that Casey could get away with anything. This is a prime environment for someone to grow to believe that they are invulnerable to realistic consequences for their poorly made decisions. In mid-June 2008, Casey and Cindy got into a very big argument about who should really be responsible for raising Kaylee. Casey left angrily with her daughter in tow, and Cindy would never see Kaylee again. Okay, so I'm going to do my best to explain this. If you were in my psychopathology class, this makes a lot more sense than if you were not in my psychopathology class or familiar with the DSM. It is our belief that Casey Anthony shows indicators of pathological narcissism, which may have been passed down in some way to her by her mother, Cindy. But since our focus is Casey, let's review her known profile with the criteria set forth in both Section 2 and Section 3 of the DSM-5 for narcissistic personality disorder. The current criteria for this diagnosis is consistent with the criteria laid out in the DSM-4, which was in use at the time that Casey Anthony was evaluated. We can see that within this more strictly defined categorical framework, we do not have enough information about Casey's behaviors to conclude that narcissistic personality disorder is an appropriate diagnosis. There are some indicators present that do coincide with this disorder, such as entitlement, exploitativeness, and a lack of empathy for others, but we fall short by 2 criteria. So that's in the left-hand column. That's what we would currently use and what should have been used at the time. So it makes sense that she was not diagnosed with this disorder, if that makes sense. If we turn to the more dimensional approach proposed in Section 3 of the DSM-5-TR, Casey's presentation appears to be much more fitting. This diagnostic framework allows for a more variable definition of narcissism, consistent with current research, which suggests that narcissistic personalities can be expressed in different types. Some different manifestations of a narcissistic personality include covert, overt, high-functioning, or malignant. Casey displays a pattern of narcissistic tendencies that is more consistent with a covert presentation of narcissism, which the more categorical diagnostic criteria is less catered to. Section 3 states that for a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, characteristic difficulty should be present in at least 2 of the following areas: identity, self-direction, empathy, and intimacy. There is evidence to support the endorsement of each of these areas with regard to Casey's personality, but the most striking ones are in empathy and intimacy. Many statements made by family members and friends point toward Casey's very surface level consideration for the people around her, as though she was a fair weather friend, or the type of person that only gets involved when the times are good or there is a self-serving benefit. You can also witness a stark difference between her affect and that of her best friend Christina when they were discussing her arrest and the importance of finding her daughter earlier in the jailhouse call that I played. Casey's long list of intimate partners and her ability to jump in and out of relationships rapidly illustrates a superficial quality to her approach to intimacy, and nonetheless, she would prioritize these relationships above all others, as demonstrated, again, in the jailhouse call. So, just to sum up, so this makes sense, Section 3 of the DSM-5 is like a proposal for when we get the DSM-6 to use this new diagnostic criteria instead of, so we're trying to replace the left column with the right column, because there's reasons to believe that although narcissism, like the underpinnings of narcissism, like the innate function of that personality disorder is the same, but it can be expressed a lot more variably than the current Section 2 criteria allows or accounts for, if that makes sense. So, additionally, antagonistic personality traits, both grandiosity and attention-seeking, are part of Casey's psychopathology. Casey's sense of entitlement is mostly the covert kind, as she leans into playing the victim each time she finds herself about to be held responsible for something. It is very possible that Casey benefited from being so disliked in the media, as it fed into her vulnerable and misunderstood self-construction. Attention-seeking is something we see both before and after the murder trial. Before, Casey's attention-seeking arena was almost exclusively for the men in her life. And after her exoneration, Casey chose to remain living in the Orlando area. She kept her legal name, she maintained the same hairstyle, against what was recommended to her, and continued frequenting local bars in her free time. This is indicative of someone who wants the attention, essentially. Additionally, Casey reaped the benefit of many networks' desires to work with her on crime-related specials, where she could complain of the way she was persecuted by the public and then, actual quote, proven innocent of one of America's most sensationalized crimes. It is not unfair to assume that Casey subscribes to the belief that all attention is good attention. It would also be important to specify for Casey that the additional antagonistic traits of manipulativeness and deceit are present and supported by a myriad of documented evidence. So, that's what we have on narcissism. Pathological lying is not a psychological diagnosis. The National Institute of Health has produced research in an attempt to gauge how prevalent this sort of lying behavior is in our country, estimating that 8 to 13% of the population qualifies as pathological liars, when defining it as various lying present for a minimum of 6 months. We can see that Casey Anthony had been lying for years before Kaylee was even born, and some of the lies she conjured would last up until police got involved and disproved them. The NIH came up with a definition of pathological lying that could be used as a separate diagnosis in a future edition of the DSM, but they also acknowledge that pathological lying is a behavior that can be found within many different diagnoses, and individuals who present with pathological lying as a symptom of another disorder likely engage in this behavior for different reasons. People with narcissistic personalities most likely engage in pathological lying for personal gain. Casey indicated in one of her mental health interviews that lying for her is a form of protection. It is very possible that her ability to lie and stick to those lies was a way of evading accountability and denying the consequences of her self-centered decisions. So, as there are some unique features to Casey's psychopathology, we also think it's important to explore the presence of antisocial personality markers. Although indicators of conduct disorder being present before the age of 15 is a requirement for the diagnosis of ASPD, and although Casey does not have any evidence of this in her history, we think it's important to discuss the other antisocial criteria that Casey meets. To be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, the DSM-5 requires a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others, as indicated by at least 3 of 7 symptoms. We find that criteria 2, 3, 6, and 7 relate most closely to what we know about Casey's history. I will say also as a caveat that we don't have indication that all of these are pervasive and have continued after the loss of Kaylee. So this slide was heavily endorsed by the other 2 people involved. But there's some credence to it, so I digress. We continue. For criterion 2, we see Casey's pathological lying is right at home. This is evidenced by the long list of stories fed to the police that were debunked at the trial. Criterion 3, which relates to impulsivity and planning issues, is supported by Casey's lack of well-thought-out plans of action regarding her employment, child rearing, and relationship management. Despite the importance of the investigation, Casey repeatedly created easily falsifiable stories on the fly with no plan of how to back them up, such as creating a very detailed imaginary child sitter. Criterion 6 is the most obvious in Casey's profile, as she was unable to maintain employment for the majority of Kaylee's lifetime. Additionally, she went out of her way to steal hundreds of dollars from people in her life who trusted her as a way to stay afloat financially, instead of working to provide for herself. Finally, we look to Criterion 7 with specific regard to the rationalizing of harm done to others. Casey not telling anyone about her missing daughter, as well as her clear lack of affect following the discovery of Kaylee's remains, indicates a lack of emotion in regard to the death. There are people affected by the death of Kaylee, such as Casey's parents, who were greatly hurt by Casey's behaviors at this time. We have no reason to believe that Casey has presented with any regret or sincere consideration for the negative impact that her choices have had on anyone related to this case. It is important to consider the possibility that, with the presence of these antisocial tendencies, Casey may qualify for an additional diagnosis of other specified personality disorder with antisocial features. Again, the reason that antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, would be inappropriate in this case is the lack of evidence of a previous childhood conduct disorder. And I personally would argue that we see no evidence of longevity of all of these criteria. Okay, so after the verdict, Casey moved somewhere unknown for about a month. On August 12th, she was ordered to return to Florida to serve a year's supervised probation for a check fraud conviction related to stealing money from one of her friends. In January 2013, Casey filed bankruptcy, citing $800,000 in liabilities. She listed around 80 creditors and reported zero income at the time. Her biggest debt was owed to her criminal defense attorney, asshole Jose Baez. $70,000 was owed to the IRS. Later in the year, she settled out of court with the nonprofit organization Texas EquiSearch, which had sued her for employing its services to find Kaylee when she already knew that Kaylee was dead. Casey lived with defense team member Pat McKenna for some years and worked underneath him as a legal assistant. She now has an IMDb page with 15 associated features, including her own docuseries on Peacock, which is a definite waste of your time, And she even has credit as an executive producer in a TV miniseries about the case. There have even been rumors of a reality show with O.J. Simpson. But thank the Lord, this has not been confirmed to be happening anytime soon. She has also covered up her Bella Vita tattoo with a large over-the-shoulder mandala. And most recently, in April of this year, she was spotted at the adults only weekend at Disney World. So she's just living it up, I guess. Lastly, we want to take a moment to talk about the wonderful little girl that Kaylee was. Her favorite color was purple. She loved Winnie the Pooh, and she always wanted to be reading books or have them read to her. In the years following Kaylee's death, a series of bills were proposed in several states that came to be known as Kaylee's Laws. Kaylee's Law would make a parent or guardian held criminally responsible for failing to report a child who is missing in situations where they knew or should have reasonably known that the child could be in danger. And that is all I wrote. And here are all of these fun little websites if you want to look at any of them. Yeah, so I guess I can end off this little recording with, I guess, my opinion. Obviously, this presentation already is a long presentation, and it is not exhaustive of the case and the evidence and the family history, and just it's so hard to get a holistic view of what happened. It is close to just not at all possible that we will ever get a legitimate confession from Casey, from what we know about her personality and what we know about people who are narcissistic. It's not the sort of thing where some other people may have a dying declaration one day on your deathbed, ready to go. You're gonna let it all. I think, as much as I would love that, I would love for her to just admit it or give us something. I don't think it's gonna happen. We also, I will say, we didn't go super deep into forensic evidence in this presentation because it's a lot more about the psychology of Casey as a crime-committing individual. But in terms of forensic evidence, I am personally led to believe, if I give my opinion on what happened that day, Casey was engaging in reactive instrumental aggression. I think she was very excitable, upset, irritated, and that had been primed by the big argument she had the night before with her mom, where it was threatened that Kaylee would be taken out of Casey's custody. And it's not something that Casey would be comfortable with, to just relinquish control of the child. It was never a question about, oh, well, I'm going to have an abortion when I'm pregnant, or I'm going to give up the child for adoption, because she has an inability to let things look like they were mistakes at all costs. There has to be an excuse. There has to be a justification, an explanation, and it's either someone else is to blame, or these were the circumstances and it's an accident that's not really wholly my fault. So this whole, okay, she's pregnant. Well, an abortion would admit that she did not want that to happen. Giving a child up for adoption would look to other people like she's incapable. She could never look incapable. And again, the threat of having her daughter taken away by her mom would make her look incapable to her boyfriend, to her friends, to her other family members. And it's infuriating it feels like a personal insult to her that her mom would say, "You are incompetent. You are not good enough. And I am, and I will take care of the baby." That's something that Casey could not tolerate. It was not an option. It was, I'm going to have this baby or no one else is. It would almost look better if in complete frustration, she doesn't even want the baby to begin with, but she has to keep the baby and raise the baby and look like a good mother because she's perfect, because she's Casey and she's perfect. It would be better in her eyes to be rid of the child completely in a way that does not look like her fault, such as being victimized. So having the child abducted, having the child murdered, makes Casey the victim as a mom. Oh my gosh, this is the worst thing to ever happen to me. My baby is gone forever. I'm such a vulnerable, innocent victim of this. And also, I am freed and unburdened by the responsibility of being a parent now. So that looks like, to her, the best way out. She may have contemplated this for some time. We have some evidence to prove that she had maybe been thinking about it as an option, like an exit plan. But I think particularly in the day that it happened, it was primed by the upsetting altercation she had with her mom, discussion about custody. It also was a personal insult to her that's like, oh, I am your daughter, and how dare you love this child more than me? I'm your child. How dare you? How dare you not love me the most? And then I'm also thinking, okay, she's at home. Both of her parents have gone to work. All it takes, after being frustrated like that and trying to think, I don't really know what to do and I can't let my mom take the child, all it takes is a regular 2-year-old toddler, normal behavior to agitate a parent in any way. Could be very simple things, like just wanting attention, repeatedly poking her, saying, "Mommy, mommy," or asking you to read with me, or "I want to go swim in the pool," or blah, blah, blah. All it takes is something to incite a frustrated response, an aggressive, an overcompensatory response. And I mean, Casey was ready and eager to justify it. The thing is, she hadn't feasibly and practically premeditated it enough to get away with it. What we see forensically is that the skull had duct tape wrapped around it 3 times. If it were an abduction situation, you would probably have their hands clasped with duct tape or rope or something, and then you would only need just enough duct tape to cover the mouth to prevent them from screaming, and having their hands clasped would prevent them from ripping it off. It doesn't make sense in an abduction situation to have no evidence of the hands being clasped on a toddler. And then wrapping duct tape around a child's skull 3 times is excessive and extremely intentional of harm, because what it implies with no duct tape on the hands and with 3 rounds of duct tape on a toddler's skull is the intent is that these tiny hands, these 2-year-old hands, will not be able to pull it off. And it went around the chin, the mouth, the nose, and these tiny baby hands are not going to be able to rip that duct tape off. and they are not going to be able to breathe. You would had to have had a good firm hold on the toddler, take the duct tape, and wrap it 3 times. 1, 2, 3 times. Rip the duct tape, secure the duct tape, and likely look the child directly in the eyes as you deprived her of oxygen. That is unspeakably horrific. And then you think the justification is, well, maybe to Casey, I loved her, it just wasn't a good fit. You know, no one else can do it. I can't do it. It's not going to happen. Now, how do I make this look like it's not what just happened? Because I will continue living my life how I want to live it at whatever cost. And thank God now Kaylee is not a problem for me anymore. That's probably, in my opinion, what happened. And it's really sobering. And then to think that this April, Casey had the audacity to go to Disney World on an adults-only weekend. If I had lost my child and I was not responsible in any way, I feel like I would never be able to set foot in Disney World, Disneyland, anything like that. A place that's it's for people of all ages, but like highly caters to children and is also one of the most trafficked places in the country, and you're just gonna go have a fun little weekend there. And I don't think that that's antisocial as we define it in the DSM. I think it's extremely narrow-minded and indicative of a complete covert narcissist. And that's all I have to say on that. Let me know if you have any comments or questions. Like and subscribe. Wow, this went to about an hour. I'm so sorry. Okay.